Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take the latest research, really boil it down, and bring the key insights straight to you. Today, we're diving into something pretty big in AI right now, maybe a bit confusing even. It's about these advancements in large language models, specifically the ones that claim they can actually think or reason.
Right.
You've probably seen mentions of these large reasoning models, LRMs they call them. They spit out these detailed thinking processes before giving an answer.
Yeah, it looks like they're showing their work, basically.
Exactly. It almost feels like they're walking you through their logic. But is it real thinking or is something else going on?
That really is the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, these models, they definitely do better on benchmarks, no doubt. Yeah. But our deep dive today, it focuses on this really fascinating new research paper. And it argues that, well, how these frontier LRMs actually work, how they scale, where they fall short. It's all still, as the paper puts it, insufficiently understood.
So we think we know, but maybe we don't have the full picture.
Precisely. The reality seems, well, a lot more nuanced.
Okay, so this whole deep dive is centered on this specific paper.
Yes, it's titled The Illusion of Thinking, Understanding the Strengths and Limitations of Reasoning Models via the Lens of Problem Complexity.
The Illusion of Thinking. That's a strong title.
It is. And they don't just look at the final answer, right or wrong. They use this really clever approach, these meticulously designed puzzle environments.
Puzzles, like actual puzzles.
Yeah, exactly. It lets the researchers peer into what they call the internal reasoning traces. It's like getting a look under the hood.
So you can see how they're thinking, not just the end result.
Exactly. That granular insight is what's been missing.
Okay, so our mission today is to unpack what this research tells us about how these LRMs work.
Right. Where that thinking actually helps, and maybe more importantly, where they hit these surprising roadblocks, especially as problems get harder.
I think you mentioned we should prepare for some aha moments.
Definitely. Some of this really challenges common assumptions about where AI reasoning is heading.
All right, let's get into it. These models that claim to think, is that just, smart branding, or is there something fundamentally different happening compared to regular LLMs?
It's a good starting point. The paper helps clear this up. When we say large reasoning models, LRMs, we're talking about specialized versions of LLMs. Think OpenAI's O1 or O3, DeepSeek R1, or those specific thinking versions of models like Claude 3.7, Sonnet, and Gemini.
Okay, so there's specific variants.
Yeah, and the key difference isn't just size, it's that they have these explicitly designed thinking mechanisms. Often this means generating a chain of thought, or COTE, basically a step-by-step reasoning process you can actually see.
Like showing your work in math class.
Kind of, yeah. Sometimes they even include self-reflection in that process. The idea is to make their problem-solving more reliable, more robust.
Got it. Making the process visible. You mentioned the paper points out problems with how we usually test these models. What's the issue there?
Well, the big challenge is that a lot of current testing uses established math and coding benchmarks.
Which seems reasonable, right?
They're valuable, for sure. But they have this issue of potential data contamination.
Meaning the models might have just seen similar problems during training.
Exactly. They might have effectively memorized solutions or parts of solutions. Plus, and this is key, these benchmarks usually just give you the final answer, pass or fail. You don't get much insight into the quality of the reasoning, the structure of those thinking steps.
Just the destination, not the journey, as you said before.
Precisely. And that makes it really hard to judge if they're genuinely reasoning or just pattern matching incredibly well.
Okay, that's a pretty big blind spot if we want to understand actual intelligence.
Yeah.
So how did these researchers get around that? What was their innovative approach?
They came up with this really smart solution. These controllable puzzle environments.
The puzzles again.
Yeah. Think of them like carefully built sandboxes. They could precisely control how complex the problems were while keeping the basic logic the same.
Okay, so they could dial the difficulty up or down very precisely.
Exactly. And this setup allowed them to analyze not just the final answer, but those internal reasoning traces, the step-by-step thoughts the models generated.
It sounds like putting the AI in a controlled lab experiment.
That's a great way to put it, observing its cognitive process in a very controlled way.
So let's talk specifics. What kinds of puzzles did they use?
They used 4 different types, each designed to test different aspects of reasoning. First, the classic Tower of Hanoi.
Oh yeah, moving the discs between pegs.
That's the one. One disk at a time. Can't put a larger one on a smaller one. The crucial thing here is its complexity scales exponentially.
Exponentially, meaning adding just one more disk makes it way harder.
Dramatically harder. The minimum number of moves explodes, so this tests recursive thinking and planning ahead, sequential planning.
Okay, what else?
Then there's checker jumping. This one's a sort of one-dimensional puzzle. Red checkers, blue checkers, an empty space in the middle.
And the goal is to swap them.
Yep. Swap their positions by sliding or jumping over opposite colors, but only moving forward. Its complexity scales quadratically with the number of checkers.
Quadratically. Still grows fast, but not exponentially. What does this one test?
This really gets at spatial reasoning and look-ahead planning. The model has to think several moves ahead to avoid getting stuck.
Makes sense. What was the third puzzle?
Third, they used river crossing puzzles. You know, those classic logic problems like missionaries and cannibals.
Right, where you have to get everyone across the river in a boat, but can't leave certain groups alone together.
Exactly. Constraint satisfaction problems. The complexity is controlled by how many pairs of actors or items are involved. This tests things like multi-agent coordination and managing constraints.
Okay, and the last one?
The fourth was blocks world. This involves rearranging stacks of blocks. You have a starting arrangement and a goal arrangement.
And the rule is just moving the top block.
Right. Only the topmost block can be moved at any time. The complexity scales with the number of blocks. It's a good test for forward thinking and keeping track of the state of the world.
So 4 distinct puzzles, each testing different skills. Why these specific ones? What makes them so useful here?
The real power is in the controlled experimentation they allow. Researchers can systematically change the compositional complexity, basically how many steps or decisions depend on each other.
So they can go from simple planning to really complex, long-horizon reasoning.
Exactly. And critically, they weren't just looking for the best or shortest solution. They were checking if each individual move the model made was correct and if the overall solution worked.
That's much more detailed than just a final pass-fail.
Much more. It gives a really granular view of the model's actual thought process, step by step.
In using this controlled setup, they uncovered some surprising patterns. Let's get into those core findings. What did they actually discover?
Well, maybe the most striking thing is that the AI's thinking isn't always helpful, or at least not linearly helpful. They compared the thinking models, like that Claude 3.7 sonnet, with thinking, against their standard non-thinking versions. And they found these 3 distinct regimes of performance as the puzzle complexity went up.
3 regimes. Okay.
Yeah, and this really pushes back against the simple idea that more thinking or longer chain of thought is always the answer.
Interesting. So it's not just more is better. Tell us about the first regime. You called it the green zone.
Right, the low complexity tasks, or the green zone.
Yeah.
For really simple problems like Tower of Hanoi with just 1 or 2 disks, or checker jumping with maybe 1 checker, the standard, non-thinking models actually did just as well.
Just as well, not worse.
And that's even better. And importantly, they were more token efficient.
Meaning they used less computation to get the same or better result.
Exactly. Less effort. It suggests that for really basic stuff, the whole thinking process might just be unnecessary overhead. Maybe even gets in the way.
That is counterintuitive. You'd assume the model designed for thinking would always have an edge. Okay, so what about regime 2, the blue zone, medium complexity?
This is where things flip. This is where the large reasoning models really start to shine. When problems get moderately complex, say Tower of Hanoi with maybe 3 to 7 disks, or checker jumping up to 7 checkers, that additional thinking, the long code T generation, it shows a clear performance boost.
Okay, so in the middle ground, the explicit reasoning steps really do help.
That's what it looks like. They seem to navigate those more complex paths more effectively.
But then there's a third regime, the red zone. You said this revealed a critical insight.
Yes, this is the crucial part. Regime 3, high complexity tasks, the red zone. Once you go beyond a certain complexity level, like Tower of Hanoi with 8 or more disks, checker jumping with 8 or more, something dramatic happens.
What's that?
Both models, thinking and non-thinking, just collapse. Their accuracy drops off a cliff, down to near zero.
Wow, near zero, regardless of the thinking.
Regardless, it's not a slow decline. It's like hitting a wall. It really points to a fundamental limitation in their current abilities.
A complete collapse. That's pretty stark. Does the paper suggest why this happens, why they hit this wall, especially the thinking models that theoretically have more capacity?
It does dive into that. They looked at the thinking tokens, basically, a measure of computational effort spent on reasoning.
Okay, how much work they were putting in.
Right, and they found something really counterintuitive. At first, as problems get harder, the LRMs do use more thinking tokens. They increase their effort.
Which makes sense. Harder problem, more thought.
Exactly. But as they get close to that accuracy collapse point, that red zone, they actually start reducing their reasoning effort.
They use fewer thinking tokens, even though the problem is harder.
Yes. Even though they still have plenty of their token budget left, it's like they just give up. Or maybe their internal process breaks down and can't effectively use the computation anymore.
That's bizarre. Like hitting a cognitive limit and just stopping trying, even if you technically could try harder.
It suggests a fundamental scaling limitation in how they currently think. And it gets even weirder when you look at how they think in simpler cases. They mention this overthinking phenomenon.
Overthinking. What does that mean for an AI?
For the simpler problems, the LRMs often find the right answer quite early in their chain of thought.
Okay, so they solve it quickly.
Yes, but then they keep going. They continue generating thoughts, exploring incorrect solutions after already finding the right one.
So they find the answer and then confuse themselves.
Essentially, yeah.
Right.
Wasting computation and sometimes even ending up with the wrong answer after having the right one earlier. It's surprisingly human in a way.
Okay, so they solve it, then potentially mess it up by thinking too much. That's for simple problems. What about harder ones?
For the moderately complex problems that Blue Zone the pattern flips, they tend to explore incorrect paths first, and then, usually later in the thought process, they arrive at the correct solution.
More like a search process, finding the right path eventually.
Kind of, yes. More iterative. But then for the high complexity problems, the red zone ones, the collapse is complete. The model just fails to generate any correct solutions within the thought process at all.
They never even find the right path, no matter how much they think.
They just can't seem to get there.
Wow. Okay, this research also found some other limitations that are really puzzling. You mentioned something about exact computation failure, even when they were given help.
This was one of the most surprising findings, I think. The researchers literally gave the models the explicit algorithm to solve the Tower of Hanoi, the step-by-step instructions.
So not asking them to figure it out, just follow the instructions. You'd think performance would skyrocket, right?
You'd absolutely expect a massive improvement. Following steps is usually much easier than figuring them out from scratch.
What?
But the model's performance did not improve. And that accuracy collapse, the red zone, it still occurred at roughly the same point.
Wait, really? Even with the exact algorithm, they still failed at the same complexity level.
Exactly. It's a really profound finding. It suggests there are deep limitations in their ability to just perform exact computations, to follow logical steps reliably, especially as the number of steps increases.
So it's not just about finding the logic, it's also about executing it consistently when things get complex.
That seems to be the implication. It challenges the idea that they just need better reasoning strategies. Maybe there's a core execution problem too.
That's a huge insight. It points to something structural. And there was another observation about inconsistent reasoning across different puzzles.
Yes, another key finding. They saw that the LRMs behaved very differently depending on the type of puzzle, even when the optimal number of moves, the sort of inherent logical depth, was similar.
Give me an example.
Okay, so a model might manage to produce, say, up to 100 correct moves in a Tower of Hanoi problem that requires maybe 31 moves for 10 disks.
Right, so it can handle a fairly long sequence there.
But then, that same model might fail to provide more than 5 correct moves in a river crossing puzzle that only requires 11 moves in total for 3 pairs.
Huh, so similar solution length? Maybe similar logical steps needed, but drastically different performance just because it's a different type of puzzle.
Exactly. Even if the underlying compositional complexity seems comparable.
What does that suggest?
Well, it strongly suggests that performance might be less about pure general reasoning ability and more influenced by other factors like data contamination. Maybe they saw lots of Tower of Hanoi examples in training, or memorization of common puzzle patterns.
So less about flexible thinking, more about familiarity with the specific problem type.
It points in that direction. If it were truly general reasoning, you'd expect performance to scale more consistently across different puzzles with similar logical demands. This inconsistency adds to that illusion of thinking idea.
Okay, let's try and pull this all together then. What are the big takeaways from this deep dive into the illusion of thinking?
I think the first major point is that These large reasoning models, even with their fancy thinking mechanisms, hit some fundamental walls. We saw those three clear regimes. Regime 1, low complexity, where standard models can actually be better and more efficient.
Right, the green zone.
Regime 2, medium complexity, the blue zone, where the LRMs really do show their advantage, where the thinking pays off.
And regime 3.
And regime 3, high complexity, the red zone, where both types of models just collapse. Accuracy craters. It's a hard limit, it seems.
And that analysis of their thinking effort was really revealing, too.
Absolutely. The overthinking on simple problems, finding the answer, then exploring wrong paths.
And the counterintuitive reduction in effort when problems get really hard right before the collapse.
Exactly. It suggests a core scaling issue, not just a lack of trying. And maybe the most startling finding, the failure to improve even when given the explicit algorithm for Tower of Hanoi.
That points to real trouble with exact computation and following steps.
It does. And combined with the inconsistent performance across different puzzle types, it really makes you question how generalizable their reasoning actually is. It might look like thinking, but maybe it's closer to sophisticated pattern matching that breaks down under enough novel complexity.
So this research really throws some cold water on the idea that we're on a straightforward path to general AI reasoning just by scaling up current methods.
I think it does. It raises crucial questions about what reasoning actually means in these models and suggests we might be hitting some fundamental barriers with current approaches. It's not just about needing more data or bigger models or longer chains of thought, potentially.
It's a call to really reevaluate how we're building intelligence into these systems.
Precisely.
Okay, so it definitely prompts some big questions. What does this all mean for the future of AI then? If just adding more thinking steps or even giving the AI the instructions isn't enough to crack complex problems, what's next? What kind of foundational shifts, maybe in architecture or training, might be needed to get past these limitations, to move beyond what this paper calls an illusion of thinking and get towards something like genuine, robust reasoning? That really is something for all of us interested in this field to think about.